All right, so I'm going to be talking to you about deviance and crime. This is our first kind of focused topic in this introductory sociology class. I want to tell you right off the bat that my department has a really wonderful criminology program. And so if you're a BGSU student who's interested at all in crime and deviance, you're very lucky because BGSU has a wonderful criminal justice program and a truly remarkable criminology program within sociology. And so if you would like this topic at all, I encourage you to take further classes. This is not really my area of research, and so I'll be talking to you about what I think are some important ideas in deviance and crime, but I'll only be giving you kind of a thumbnail sketch. So when sociologists think about deviance and crime, they're really thinking about social control. And social control are techniques and strategies for preventing deviant human behavior in any society. And that we engage in social control techniques or strategies for preventing deviance by using sanctions. And so sanctions is kind of a word that seems really negative, but it can be either negative or positive. And so a sanction is a penalty or a reward for conduct concerning a social norm. And that society kind of defines people's willingness to accept shared beliefs and values and practices. And so society can limit individual freedom or advance their interest of some at the expense of others. So let me give you some examples of sanctions. If a student cheats in class, they'll receive a negative sanction, right? They'll go up to the academic honesty committee. If a student does a great job for her employer, she's likely to get a raise, and so that would be a reward for conduct concerning a norm, right? And so the same thing occurs when we're thinking about criminal kinds of behavior. Some people might receive extreme sanctions, be penalized, be given fines, be put in jail, be given long sentences, and those we would consider to be penalties about a norm. But we might set up laws where only certain people are kind of treated negatively for committing certain kinds of crimes, while other people are ignored. And so it's kind of important to think about how the social purposes and uses of sanctions. So when we're thinking about why people might kind of obey the norms around them or obey what other people are doing or follow along, there's two terms that are really important to distinguish. There's conformity, and that's the act of going along with peers, going along with people who have no special right or authority over you, right? They hold the same status as you do. And so these are people who are like your peers. You conform to what they do, but you don't necessarily have to. Obedience is a different thing. Obedience is compliance with higher authorities in a hierarchical structure. And so what Milgram was really trying to study is he was trying to study behavior that's unthinkable in an individual, somebody who thinks that they would never engage in humane behavior, and about why they would do that, why would they execute negative behavior without hesitation when it's carried out under orders. And so he was really looking at our compulsion towards obedience. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind, that in life we're making decisions about whether we're going to conform or obey. So what are the two types of social control? Well, there's informal and formal forms of social control. And informal social control is carried out casually by ordinary people through things like laughter, smiles, ridicule, exclusion. I don't know if any of you ever received the cold shoulder from someone and they refuse to talk to you. So that's a form of informal social control. If I give somebody a dirty look because they're talking in a movie, if you kind of make a shh sound at somebody who's using their cell phone somewhere public, that would be informal social control. Formal social control is carried out by authorized agents. So police, officers, judges, school administrators, employers, and that they have authorization to use formal social control, to use force, to use penalties of some form. So you might want to think through, there's an example in the media right now, as I'm making this lecture, United Airlines is receiving negative attention because they decided to remove a passenger from a plane who had purchased a ticket and was seated and ready to leave, and that 3 police officers used physical force and the person became injured. And so whenever we're talking about formal social control, it's interesting to think about who might be looking at that social control, who might look at whether someone is authorized and just or authorized and unjust in their use of the social control. And so that's something that's kind of a sociological question. When we're really thinking about more formal forms of social control, what we're really talking about is laws. So in fact, some norms are so important to a society that they're formalized into laws. And so a law is a formal, state-enforced norm. And so in diverse societies, you have the establishment of laws inevitably, and that they're inevitably going to generate conflict over whose values should prevail. And so, for example, we know that in the recent decades or so, an enormous percentage of minorities as compared to whites are incarcerated for pretty small drug offenses. But now we're trying to set up laws so that people can, in at least 2 states, run businesses to sell marijuana, right? And so we're kind of looking at how we use laws to create differences between groups. And so the people who seem to be getting these licenses tend to be upper class and wealthier white people. And so we're looking at how our laws in society are, sending some people to prison for selling small amounts of marijuana, while others are going to be made rich because they have licenses to engage in business. And so that's interesting to kind of look at the sociological consequences of inequality in our laws. So something I'm going to really talk to you about is how when we're thinking about when people are deviant or criminal, how sometimes some people are kind of considered deviant and criminal even if they haven't done anything, while other people who engage in deviant behavior or behavior that receives social censure, they're not considered deviant at all. And so an example would be binge drinking on campus, for example. And so here you have some research. It's a pretty old study now, but recent studies are kind of holding this up. And it's looking at how often in any given drinking session, men drink 5 or more drinks at a time, and women drink 4 or more drinks at a time. And then what you see is college men and women, they're equally likely within the last 2-week period to engage in binge drinking. So about half of men and women in college will binge drink in this 2-week time period, in a 2-week time period. And what's interesting is to see that the social context in which people live really have an impact. And so people who live in substance-free residence halls, 1/3 of them are going to engage in binge drinking, half of people who are in regular residence halls, so 45%, and then fully 75% of people who are members of fraternities and sororities. And so we can see that there's different social contexts that promote different kinds of levels of deviance. And then when you look at the age breakdown, you can see that only 44%, only 44% of students who are under age 21 engage in binge drinking, 50% who are in the 21 to 23 age range, and then students who are older, 1/3 of them do. And so you can see that it almost seems like it's a life stage or life cycle phenomenon, that people are kind of funneling themselves into particular living situations that might promote binge drinking. It's an age-defined phenomenon. People who are of legal age to engage in drinking and they're away from their parents might do it more. But we don't necessarily look down on people who are engaging in binge drinking. We think of it as part of the party culture or the fun of college, right? We might only start to look negatively at it if it began to interfere with their lives, with their employment or their academic success. And so here's an example. We frown on binge drinking. We don't approve of it, and yet we don't necessarily think of people who engage in it as deviant. Another example, as I had kind of brought up before, is about marijuana laws, right? And so what you know is that in the United States, we have this real kind of tapestry of conflict over how we're going to manage marijuana. And so, for example, you know that in Washington and Colorado, it's legal to purchase marijuana for personal recreational use. And then there's additional states where you can purchase marijuana for medical purposes if you have a license, if you have a prescription from a doctor. So, for example, I live in Ohio, and my cardiologist lives in Michigan. And so if I lived in Michigan, I might be able to get a medical marijuana prescription. But I live in Ohio, and so that's not an option for me, right? And so it's interesting to kind of think about the conflicts. I have a doctor in another state, but I can't get a prescription from him, right? And then another thing that's sort of interesting is to think about states that are considering it and then not choosing it. So, for example, within the last few years, Ohio had a bill proposal that we could vote on that would permit individuals to have up to 3 marijuana plants in their backyard, and that would issue licenses to other people to sell marijuana, right? And so that initiative was defeated. And so it's kind of interesting to look at state-level differences on how we treat marijuana and whether people are going to be punished for marijuana or go to jail for marijuana as compared to other states where there are kind of state-sanctioned means for obtaining marijuana. And so again, think about the sociological consequences of how we define crime and deviance. So that leads me to, how do we define crime and deviance? And so basically, deviance is behavior that violates expected rules, standards, and norms. And then again, much like there's formal and informal social control, there's formal and informal deviance. And so formal deviance are behavior that break laws or official rules. And that's crime, such as crime. Not always crime, but such as crime. And informal deviance is behavior that violates customary norms. So for example, if you steal from somebody, steal their computer, you're breaking a law. If you cheat on an exam, maybe you're not going to experience legal consequences, but you will go through the official procedures of the university. You'll go through the justice procedures within the university, student code of conduct. And so that's an example of formal deviance. Informal deviance is behavior that violates customary norms. So for example, if somebody, as gross as this is, picked their nose in public, we would think that's really deviant, but we wouldn't necessarily have them thrown in jail. We wouldn't be able to do that. And so again, deviance really varies across time and history, across societies, and across different groups within society. So for example, in the past, women couldn't vote, right? But now we would consider it really deviant if women went to the voting polls and they were turned away, right? That would be considered a really gross deviance. So again, really reflect on the fact that what we consider deviant is really kind of culture and societally specific. So here on the left, you have a photo of a young man, a young white man, and he's got face tattoos. And if we saw him at a coffee shop in Ann Arbor, we might kind of be taken aback. We might look at him and say, oh my gosh. And if we were his, somebody who's of the older generation, we might look at him and say, oh my gosh, he's really going to interfere with his chances of being employed. No employer is going to want to hire someone who has such kind of obvious markings. But this young woman, even though we don't know where she's really living, we suspect that maybe she's a young woman of an African tribe, and that we might assume that, hey, in her tribe, this facial tattooing might be a marker of independent womanhood, of her coming to age and being considered a woman of her community. And it might be considered a sign of great beauty. So for example, in the media, over the summer, I heard a story about tattoos in Inuit culture in Alaska, right? And these women, it used to be a custom that women would receive facial tattoos, and that the facial tattoos were these really straight lines, right? And that if the lines were super straight, that meant that the women could really take the pain of getting the tattoo, and that they were strong women, and that you could only get the tattoos when you reached adulthood, and that when you had survived really kind of major challenges like childbirth or getting married or doing some significant contribution to community. But for a while, those tattoos have been lost to time. That there had been the movement of Western culture. Colonialists came. There was the oppression of their ancient tribal rituals, religious oppression, that they were kind of forced to become more Christianized. And so they lost some of their customs. And so this news story was talking about how mummies were found with tattoos. And so current contemporary tattoo artists were able to kind of figure out, what do these tattoos look like? And so now it looks like there are some people in this community that are trying to reestablish that custom. And so here's an example. Tattoos being an important part of a custom or traditions, falling away over time, and then being reestablished. And so it's interesting to think about why we define some things as deviant and others as not. So what are some sociological definitions of deviance? For a few minutes, I'm going to talk to you about different theoretical perspectives, at the most broad. And so a sociological definition of deviance is it's really going to stress the social context and not necessarily individual behavior. It's going to recognize that not all behaviors are judged similarly by all groups. So for example, we might judge a lower class person for cheating much more harshly than we might judge somebody who's from an elite family who can kind of hide the child who cheats from the consequences. And we might recognize that there are established rules and norms that are socially created and that can be changed if they're challenged. And so how does a functionalist theory look at deviance? And you'll remember that functionalist theories kind of grow out of Emil Durkheim's work. And so functionalist theories say, hey, deviance can occur in societies for one of two reasons, or maybe a combination of both. Deviance can result when there are structural strains in societies, meaning the structural ways we regulate people. And so if deviance can result if some people are being treated too harshly by laws, and so they choose to be deviants. Or deviance might arise if there's really a big gain from crime. And so, for example, if there's a real impulse in society to make a huge profit from drug selling, that people might be deviant, and that there's not necessarily laws or police forces to regulate the behavior. And so some forms of deviance arise because of problems in regulating people. And then other forms of deviance occur when people's attachment or social bonds to each other or their attachment to society is diminished. And so it's problems with integration. And so, of course, Durkheim said that, hey, in cultures that are highly religious and highly conservative and highly traditional, people are pretty obedient to the rules and norms. They follow things because they feel really kind of connected and to society. And in other societies where there's a lot of communal arrangements, a lot of sharing of social and civic life, people feel bonded and included, strong families, that kind of thing. And so they feel less likely to be deviant. But in a society where there's been a disruption, either there's been like a falling away of religious principles or a sudden rise in kind of independence, people are more interested in personal liberation, that there might be deviance because people feel less attached to following the rules. But from the functionalist theory's idea, deviance is not necessarily a bad thing in any given society, and that deviance can maybe ultimately create even greater social cohesion. Because when you start seeing deviant people, one of the benefits is that you can really develop a sense of it's us against them. You know who the bad guys are, and so you can articulate even better what the values and beliefs are of the society, right? And that not only that, but in the punishment and in the regulation and in addressing the deviance, you can articulate for yourself and enact what you think are your values. And so, for example, he was really interested in studying how we use laws to punish people. And then he was even looking at really simple, kind of primitive or tribal societies. And he argued in those societies, it was really critical that everyone is obedient and complies to the norms because everyone's life depends on it, right? That there's not much room for error. And so he argued in those societies, you really did develop kind of a notion of justice that overreaches, that justice that far surpasses the penalty or the crime. And so if someone steals from you, you cut off their hand. And so functionalist theory kind of really looks at how we use people's deviance action to articulate the norms of society. Then there's symbolic interactionist theory, and I'll actually kind of talk about this quite a bit throughout the semester. And so symbolic interactionist theory, you'll remember, was a theoretical perspective that says that we develop norms and social relations by our one-on-one interactions with each other and about our sense of accountability about whether we're going to follow the norms or not, or whether we're going to work to create new norms. And so basically symbolic interactionist theory says that, hey, deviance is a learned behavior and it's reinforced through group membership. And so, for example, someone isn't just born one day, and turn 17 and suddenly decide, I'm going to smoke marijuana, and this is going to be the easiest thing I've ever done, right? That you have to actually learn how to properly smoke marijuana. You've got to learn where to buy it. You've got to learn how to kind of treat the leaves, take out the rough parts or the seeds. You've got to learn how to roll it if you're going to smoke it in paper. If you're going to use a bong, you have to figure out what kind of bong and how to make one. There's a whole set of procedures, right? And that if you're going to be with people, maybe they have kind of rules of conduct, like when they smoke, why they smoke, what are the rituals of sharing a bong. Might have like how you do it. And so this is a learned thing. It's not a casual thing at all. And so what symbolic interactionist theory says is, hey, any sort of behavior is not necessarily deviant in and of itself. It becomes deviant through the process of social labeling. And that social labeling can occur regardless of even whether you've actually committed any deviant act at all. And so it's those with power to assign deviant labels that actually create the deviance. And so let me give you an example. Say you live in a really small rural town, and that you are a very religious person and your family goes to church a lot, right? And so on one Friday night, say you're a 16-year-old girl, you are out with your friends and you kiss a boy. And for whatever reason, they decide to make rumors about you. And they spread rumors around school that you've done more than just kiss the boy, right? And so you actually haven't committed anything, right? You've kissed a boy, you haven't engaged in sexual contact, you haven't had sexual intercourse, you haven't been promiscuous in any particular way, you've simply kissed a boy, but the rumors are spreading, right? And so then you get labeled a slut. And so that would be an example of getting labeled without actually committing the act, that you would get labeled and have the consequences of it, right? And that you would experience the social labeling, right? And then other times you actually are committing an act, like say you are learning how to purchase marijuana and sell it and share it with your friends, and which are your favorite ways to have it, to smoke it, to whether like to eat it, when you like to use it. You have all of these kinds of rules and norms for how you engage in smoking marijuana. So we know sometimes in history that wasn't considered deviant, but at other times it was, right? And now, depending on what state you're in, that could be considered not just deviant but criminal, right? The same thing with alcohol, right? We know that there are moments in history where uh, there's prohibition, and so the act of drinking alcohol is absolutely illegal. And now we simply regulate it, right? We have age restrictions, we have amount of blood content, alcohol blood contact laws, but generally we acknowledge it as not necessarily being deviant, though potentially perhaps being criminal. And so symbolic interactionism is really interested in this process of labeling and defining and how people learn how to be deviant. And they especially focus on the labeling component. And so they say that, hey, the responses of others are most significant factor in how deviant behavior is created and sustained. So for example, well, anyway, let me get through this part. The power to label an act or a person as deviant results in real social consequences, profound social consequences. And that, in fact, getting rid of a label is profoundly difficult, right? It's really hard. Once you become labeled as something, people kind of don't forget it. And so a person may become deviant because of a label, even if he or she didn't engage in deviant behavior. So let me give you a couple examples. Say you have been arrested for selling marijuana and you go to jail, and that you've sold a sufficient amount that you are facing a felony arrest. And now you're out of jail and you're in a state that requires that you tell the employers that you have a felony conviction record. And so here you are labeled. You're labeled a felon. And so even if you never ever commit another criminal act, people will look at you as a felon and decide whether they want to give you a job or not. And so that deviant label is going to have an enormous impact on your life. Say you're that young girl I was talking about, and that you've been defined by your really tiny hometown community as a slut. Breaking from that label is going to be profoundly difficult. And in fact, some people may never believe it, right? And so that's really consequential. And this is a person who didn't commit the act, right? Let me think of another example. I think those are two pretty good ones. Yeah, I think I'll stop with that. And so what's interesting, oh, I know. So in the family development literature, when we think about the consequences of the words and labels we use at people, and about how they would have real social consequences, the research really shows that when parents and community members aim negative words at children, that has enormous consequences. So for example, children who are raised in a home where they are receiving neglectful and abusive words, where they're being told that they're stupid, or they're ugly, or they're unloved, or they're unlovable, that those children really do work, they grow up feeling really impaired and feeling really kind of not necessarily as worthy of love and care as others. And so that's an example of the power of labels, right? And so with labeling theory, there's three kind of stages of labeling. And so there's primary deviance, when you actually violate a norm or a law. So you've done it. You've rolled that joint and you've smoked it. You've driven drunk. You have picked your nose in public. You have done something that's deviant or criminal. You may never even get discovered. So for example, you may binge drink on campus many weekends throughout your first year of college. And you might have hangovers, and you might get made fun of, and your mom might find out and yell at you, but no one really, nothing really happens, no consequences. You don't end up in jail. You don't end up kicked out of the family. Secondary deviance is the behavior that results from being labeled deviant, regardless of whether the person engaged in deviance or not, right? And so now your behavior has been caught up by social life, social groups, or those in authority to judge you, right? And so maybe you were pulled over by the police, and now you have gone through court, and now you have to go through court-mediated rehab. You have to do some sort of community service, and so now you're getting labeled as a drunk driver, right? And the consequences are real. Tertiary deviance is when the deviant fully accepts the deviant role and rejects the stigma associated with it. And so somebody who is taking pride in being a drug dealer, somebody who really is proud of how good they are at selling marijuana and enjoying marijuana and picking the best kinds of brands of marijuana, right? So people who are really identifying with the deviance. And so sociologists kind of like to look at this very social process of how deviants define themselves and how they're defined by others. The last perspective I want to look at is conflict theories of deviance. And so conflict, you remember, has come from Karl Marx, and he's looking at different groups and how they struggle over control. And so in this theoretical perspective, dominant classes control the definition of and sanctions attached to deviance, right? And that deviance results from inequality in society. And so that includes class, race, and gender inequalities. And that what the bottom line is that elite deviance, the deviance that the ones in control of society commit, is going to go largely unrecognized and unpunished. So, for example, this theory might say, hey, if you're poor, really poor, and you are being kind of shoved out of the marketplace, and you're not getting equal access to education, and the jobs that you work in and that you work hard at aren't paid well, that you might end up stealing to feed your family, right? And strangely enough, the penalties for stealing food might be more severe than what a rich person does, like the crime the rich people might do. And so this kind of really looks at, are there inequalities in how we manage, how we treat people based on where they're stratified in social structure. Okay, so I really want to specifically look at stigma. A stigma is an attribute that's socially devalued and discredited. So a stigma is when people look at you and they really see you as a lower class or lower status, or somebody who should be more humiliated, somebody who's not of same par as somebody else. And so people who have a stigma are treated as deviant, regardless of whether they're committing a deviant act or not. And that often the stigma can become a master status. So for example, I gave you earlier the example of disability, that someone may be a brilliant genius like Stephen Hawking, but society may still treat you like you're a disabled person in a wheelchair. And so a stigma is kind of like that people are looked down and demeaned for a category. And that often if people are being stigmatized, they end up with spoiled identity. And so, for example, somebody who, they were slinging drugs when they were teenagers. They were trying to sell drugs in order to help their family because a parent was in jail, and that they end up getting caught in the juvenile delinquent system, and that they have a hard time getting through school because of that. They may end up having a spoiled identity. They feel like their life chances were affected by the stigma attached to it. But then again, there are some people who have chosen stigmas, right? And so it's really interesting that we kind of look at, we look more harshly at people that we think are choosing a stigma. And so, for example, people who are abusing drugs or abusing alcohol, that we kind of look at them maybe not as having an addiction, but instead of being careless and irresponsible. So, for example, last year, there was a huge viral social media photos going around of a man and a woman passed out in a car that they'd overdosed on drugs, and a child was in the back seat, right? And so we looked at them so negatively and wanted to shame them with photos because we perceived them as being irresponsible and choosing that addiction, right? And so it's interesting to see how we use and apply stigmas in society. Now I'm specifically going to look at crime. So crime is behavior, like I said before, that violates actual laws, criminal laws. And so, yeah, not all deviance is crime, right? And criminology is the study of crime from a scientific perspective. In our department, we have an enormous array of sociologists who study criminology and do a wonderful job. And so the classifications of crime are personal, property, victimless, and hate crimes. And so personal crimes are crimes against people, against their bodies. And this can include murder, aggravated assault, and you can have aggravated assault with a weapon or simple assault with your own hands, like you're using your hands, your body to attack somebody else's body. Rape and robbery, taking somebody from somebody's body. Property crimes are burglary, larceny, auto theft, and arson. So you're taking things from people. Victimless crimes are things that are kind of regulated by law that are criminal, but we don't necessarily think that they're victims of them, or at least there's social disagreement about that. So, for example, gambling. We know that gambling, we are concerned about gambling. We have laws set up to try to prohibit people from losing everything they own and then defaulting on their debts. We know we have lots of laws about illegal drug use. We have lots of laws about prostitution, though some states are not thinking of prostitution as illegal. And so we think of these things as victimless. We think that, for example, in prostitution, Women are willing to sell their bodies, and so why shouldn't people want to purchase sexual access, right? But others look at it and they say, maybe there are victims to this. So, for example, in prostitution, a lot of research shows that women who engage in prostitution often experienced child abuse and child sexual abuse and had far more limited resources and far more experiences of physical assault as they were growing up than women in the general population. When you look at gambling, there's all sorts of research that shows that gambling casinos themselves can identify people that they can tell have gambling addictions. So, for example, when I lived in Louisiana, there was a gigantic court case going on that the casinos in New Orleans were, they would send a limousine to the homes of people who had drug or gambling addictions on the day that they were paid. The casinos actually even knew the day that they were paid and would give them a free room at the hotel for the weekend in order, or at the casino hotel in order to gamble, because they knew that that person would end up losing their entire paycheck, right? And then the lawsuit was about how can an industry hurt the community by taking people and making them destitute, and also hurt those families by capitalizing on someone's addiction. And so that's an example about how even the notion of victimless when we engage in criminal behavior is kind of socially constructed. And then there's hate crimes. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about hate crimes for a really brief lecture later. But hate crimes are a category of crime where you're looking at personal or property crimes, and you're really interested in knowing whether the acts, the malicious acts, were motivated by a hate bias. And so the FBI really has to determine, is this personal or property crime motivated by a real hostility or animus towards the victim? Now, the important thing to know is that when we report crimes to the police, we are not necessarily reporting all crimes. And so 49% of all violent crimes are reported to the police, and 37% of property crimes are reported to the police. And this is from National Crime Victimization Surveys. So what we have in this, when we think about data and the importance of data, is that we have two forms of data, right? If we're studying crimes, we study what's reported to the police. What administrative records do we have from the police? But given that so many people don't report crimes, we often also use victimization surveys. So we send out surveys to the United States population and we ask them, hey, has any of this happened to you in the past year? And so often people are willing to tell what they think is confidential information on a survey that they wouldn't necessarily report to the police. And so what's interesting to think through is, why might there be underreporting of crimes to the police? When you look at sexual assault, you can see it's an incredibly small percentage of all rapes and sexual assaults are reported. And so only 27%. And we know part of that is because people are concerned about how they could call the police on somebody that has hurt them that they're married to, or that they're in a dating relationship. And so it's very difficult to kind of think about how your intimate relationship with somebody impacts whether you want to report them, right? But when we look at property crime, what we know is that oftentimes there's real race differences. So blacks and Hispanics, they live in communities where they don't necessarily feel like they can trust the police, right? That they can't trust them to care about their property in the same way. And in some communities, often minorities have arrest warrants out for them. And so they may be in a poor community and they've received a ticket for parking illegally. And that illegal ticket has turned into an arrest warrant. And so they're afraid to call the police. If they've been burgled or they've been assaulted, they're afraid to call the police because they feel like they might be arrested for a secondary thing. And so it's important to kind of think about that. The dynamics of where can you get good data to study crime, and the social dynamics about why people would be reluctant to tell the police about a crime that's happened to them. So I've talked to you about personal and property crimes. I'd like to focus a little bit on other specific forms of crimes for a bit. So first, let's think about white-collar or elite crime. And so this includes things like embezzlement, insider trading, tax evasion, getting around laws to try to save your money rather than pay the federal government. And so when we think about kind of crime, this elite crime, in terms of total dollars, white-collar crime is much more consequential to society in terms of lost dollars than street crimes, than people stealing, carjacking, that kind of thing. And so it's interesting that we don't gather official statistics on white-collar crime, on this elite crime. Instead, we get official statistics, FBI Uniform Crime Report statistics on personal and property crime. And then there's organizational crime. And so organizational crime is really interesting because it's showing people coordinated in a criminal enterprise. So, for example, a sexual assault by Catholic priests. And so you remember, if maybe you saw that movie Spotlight, that they were looking at the Boston Globe and how they uncovered that the Catholic Church, for a period of time, when they discovered that Catholic priests were engaging in abuse of children, would simply move the priest to another parish, right? That they were not removing people or including the police. They were just kind of moving priests around, right? And so that's an example of organizational crime, an endeavor to hide crime. Another example is the Enron, and about how the accountants at Enron, this really very prestigious Fortune 500 company, that they were cooking their books to look like they were making profit, when actually what they were doing is taking money out of the pensions of their workers. And so they were engaging in stealing from their own company and their employees and engaging in malpractice. Then there was a 2007, 2008 housing bubble. And so I don't know if any of you have seen that movie, The Big Short, but they looked at these subprime mortgages for properties that were not valuable, that were really high-risk commodities, and that what happened was that the mortgage brokers were packaging all these high-risk loans together, and that credit rating agencies were willing to pretend that they were of a higher grade of security than they really were, and that banks were willing to buy them up because they were kind of floating or diffusing the risks across the banks. And that we know that that created an economic disaster for the market, right? So that's a coordinated activity to kind of commit crime. And then, of course, the mafia, the example of the mafia, about how they extort businesses. They steal money from businesses. They bribe officials. They launder their criminal activity, their drug money, through businesses. And so that's an example of organizational crime. Now, the last few things I want to talk about is looking at women in crime, and then looking at kind of race, ethnic differences in crime. And so when we look at crime, we see that women, much more than in the past, are likely to be committing crime. And so in the past, women were really unlikely to. If they did, they might have done it at younger ages and then commit things like shoplifting, that kind of thing. But now it looks like women are starting to look more and more like men in their criminal profiles, and that they're starting to engage in more and more severe forms of crime. And so people look at that and they're wondering why. And so criminologists who study this say that one reason might actually be the rise in women's labor force participation, basically meaning that women have more chances to commit crime. They're a lot more likely to be out in public. So they might have a better chance of stealing from their employer. They might have a better chance of engaging in embezzling, that kind of thing, right? And then the other one is that there might be these shifts in images of womanhood. And so our popular media, our songs, our movies, they're showing in a more empowered and possibly dangerous form of womanhood. So I don't know if you've seen that movie with Margot Robbie, right, where she plays Harley Quinn, right? That's an example of like an image of womanhood that's nasty and dangerous. And then another reason is they argue that even though women have increased their education and their labor force participation, they still face enormous wage and employment inequalities as compared to men. And so they're still likely to be disproportionately poor, with family obligations, and that with the rise of divorce, that they're responsible for more family members than they might have been in the past. And so there might be pressure on them to engage in crime. So that's kind of an interesting thing, thinking about women in crime. I like to think about kind of the research on policing of minorities. And so what we know is that minority communities, like black communities, Hispanic communities, are policed more heavily than white neighborhoods. So police cars are more likely to drive through. Police on foot are more likely to be there as a presence. And that you might look at that and think, well, that's good. I mean, why wouldn't people want police in their communities? But the thing is that policing in minority communities has a different effect than in white middle class communities. And so, for example, research really shows that police presence in minority communities is often far more hostile. And so people are stopped and told, asked what they're doing, stopped and required to show papers. If they're standing outside of a grocery store chatting with their friends, they're more likely to be dispersed, that kind of thing. And so an example is in my own research, that I used to do research in a low-income housing community, and this one man, in my study was reporting he was a young father and he had his newborn baby in kind of a stomach sling, right? He was holding the baby on his chest, and he'd gone down to the store to get some food, and he was standing outside with his friends talking about new fatherhood, and the police came and made him get in the police car, that they wanted to know what he was up to and why he was there and malingering. And so that's an example that the community might be treated more negatively. And so that kind of brings us to the term of racial profiling. And so that's the use of race alone to decide whether you're going to stop and detain someone. So whether you're going to stop someone in their automobile, whether you're going to pull them out of line at the airport for more security check, that kind of thing. And we know that we have kind of a complicated relationship with racial profiling. That technically, legally, racial profiling is more or less illegal, but that police are given great discretion about engaging in it. And so what's interesting is that the crime rate for blacks and Hispanics is higher than that of whites, but the majority of blacks and Hispanics don't commit crimes, and there are some crimes that whites commit more than blacks, and it's not clear that if blacks are committing crime at higher rates, whether it's tied to other things like poverty or class differences. And so this is kind of an interesting issue. Now, if you're a criminologist, I really encourage you to get to the Department of Justice webpage and look up some of their reports on this. And so, for example, they did a study on Ferguson, Missouri, and that you might remember that is the community that had those riots a few years ago because the police shot and killed a young man, an 18-year-old man, and he was on the street for most of the day because he had stolen cigarettes from a gas station, right? And so what the Department of Justice found, the FBI went in and did an investigation, is that the community was actively, the government community and the police community was actually engaging in racial profiling. And so the police were told, hey, we want you to arrest as many people as you can in any given month, and that they had an employee of the month, police officer of the month, who earned the most money for the city by arresting the most people and issuing the most tickets. Police were told where to go in order to kind of set up roadblocks, and it was done specifically to try to get more parking or traffic tickets. People weren't told where to go to pay for their tickets, or were told incorrect times for going to court. A lot of people were extremely poor and they couldn't take the time it would take a full day to wait at court to be disposed. And so there was all this kind of treating of the community in a negative way. And that the FBI was even talking about how a lot of the police officers who were white didn't necessarily live in Ferguson, where the community that's largely black was being kind of treated by the police in this fashion. And that the FBI found that the community was doing this, the government and the police, in order to raise funds for the city. And so kind of unfair treatment of the community in order to raise funds. So that's an example of kind of like inequalities in crime. So then last few things I want to talk about is race and sentencing and the death penalty, and about the era of mass incarceration. So what we know for sure, and there's researchers in my department who study this, is that Black, Latino, and Hispanics are more likely to be arrested, sent to trial, found guilty, and sentenced to longer punishments than whites, net of the type of crime and their characteristics. And so in survey research is showing time and time again that even when you control for same education, same background characteristics, Blacks and Latinos and Hispanics will receive much more harsh treatment at every stage of the criminal justice procedure or system than will whites. And so that's sort of an interesting process or interesting dynamic. And then when we look at the death penalty, we know that of over 3,000 prisoners who are currently on death row, 44% are black, though blacks are only about 11% of the population. And so blacks are disproportionately on death penalty or on death row. And that research shows really two kind of interesting things about the death penalty. One is that when whites and minorities commit the same crime against a white victim, minorities are more likely to receive a more severe sentence, including more likely to receive a death penalty sentence, right? And that when someone who kills a white person, is 3 times more likely to get the death penalty than someone who kills an African American, regardless of the race of the perpetrator, right? So you can be a white person or you can be a black person. If you kill a white person, you're much more likely to get the death penalty than if you've killed a black person. And so this sociologists look at as one of the points of perhaps inequality, kind of a conflict theorist perspective on inequality in the criminal justice system. Now I want to talk to you about prisons. I've put 2 videos that I want you to watch by Bruce Western, who's an important demographer, a criminal justice scholar and demographer, and then Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's a writer for The Atlantic and who writes a great deal about issues around race relations in the United States. And their videos are about how in just recent decades we've seen a real shift in the U.S. prison system. And so more than half of the federal and state male prisoners in the United States are racial minorities. Blacks have the highest rates of imprisonment, followed by Hispanics, then Native Americans, and then Asians. And the United States and Russia have the highest rates of incarceration in the world. And that, in fact, we're far higher than Russia, that we are the number one nation in terms of the percentage of our citizens that we incarcerate. And that has been a real sudden shift in what we're doing. That you can see that throughout much of the 20th century, we were kind of incarcerating about 100 out of 100,000 citizens, and that now, within the past 10 to 15 years, that's increased to about 700 out of 100,000. So it's been an enormous increase. And that a lot of sociologists studying this argue that part of the reason that's occurred is because we've really moved towards privatizing our prisons. And so when they're private for profit, there's a profit for every body that's in them for the corporations who are running the prisons, right? And so we're kind of looking at that, the shift from public to private prisons and how it's impacting citizens. And so sociologists call this the era of mass incarceration, that we see really vast differences in race and class in the likelihood of a child experiencing a mother or father's imprisonment, and that a large percentage of poor and minority children will experience their parents going to prison by the time they're age 18. And so sociologists are now studying how, for some parts of our population, imprisonment is now part of the life course, right? That families have to kind of think through what will happen if we lose a parent. How will we make sure that our children see a parent in jail? And so this is a real extreme inequality that we're kind of addressing as a society. And so, for example, children whose parents are high school dropouts and who are from poor communities and who are minorities, the majority of them are likely to experience a parent going to jail as compared to an elite a child who's white, whose parents are college educated. And so we're trying to think through how can we address this era of mass incarceration and the inequalities it creates for people in society. And so here's a slide that kind of tries to get you to visualize this. And so it's showing you the United States far surpassing the next highest nation, which is the Russian Federation, and even surpassing like South Africa. So there you go. I will have a brief thing to say to you about hate crimes, but that's for another lecture.